Today is February 18th, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues. Ukrainian forces are withdrawing from parts of Avdeevka. This is part of an overall continuous process of Russia degrading Ukrainian military capabilities, grinding down Ukrainian forces along the entire line of contact. And this is the end result. And this illustrates exactly how Russia's overall strategy of attrition works, or as Alexander Mikuritz of the Duran calls it, aggressive attrition. Let's look at the live map. This is liveuamap.com. I specifically choose a pro-Ukrainian live map to show people that even pro-Ukrainian sources are admitting, at least to a certain extent, how bad things are along the line of contact. So let's look here. You can see along the entire line of contact, as it has been for weeks and weeks, months actually, Russia has the initiative. They are attacking all along the line of contact. And again, as usual, most attention is focused here on Avdeevka. Avdeevka is right outside Donetsk city, and Avdeevka has been one of these very heavily fortified cities that Ukraine has used to shell primarily the civilian population of Donetsk city for years, since 2014, as a matter of fact. Now, even this pro-Ukrainian live map is showing having completely cut the industrial area of Avdeevka away from the southern part of the city. And you can see these red rifle icons deep inside the city. That indicates that Russian forces are in the process of fighting and clearing out the Ukrainian troops in this area. And this translates into headlines across the Western media. This is being admitted by the Western media as well. This is from the New York Times, February 15th, 2024. Losing ground, Ukraine seeks new positions around Avdeevka. As Russian forces breach a supply line and seek to encircle opposing soldiers, Ukraine's commanders maneuver to more advantageous positions. And this is just a euphemism for retreat. Ukrainian forces are retreating. The New York Times article claims, in a war of mostly small territorial gains, the capture of Avdeevka would be the Russians' most significant battlefield achievement since taking Bakhmut last May. But that's only if you consider battlefield achievements to be territorial gains. Isn't Russia's continuous process of grinding down Ukrainian forces, depleting their weapons and ammunition, isn't that a battlefield achievement? It is, and this is what the Western media, Western political leaders, military leaders, and Western analysts, this is what they have been getting wrong all along. And this, again, is a perfect example of what Alexander Mikuritz calls aggressive attrition. It isn't just two forces facing off along the line of contact, trying to wear each other down. Russia deliberately creates strategic dilemmas for Ukraine, forcing Ukraine, for mostly political reasons, to feed manpower and equipment into these cities, where Russia has very carefully prepared what are essentially kill zones, artillery, infantry, multiple launch rocket systems, military aviation, long-range ballistic missiles. All of this is finely tuned to target these areas and just consistently wipe out one group after another of Ukrainian soldiers. Then the New York Times admits that not only are Russian forces wiping out Ukrainian forces, yes, this process of sending additional units, including some of the best trained and best equipped units, they're being sent to Avdeevka in an attempt to delay the inevitable. It says signs of Ukraine's deteriorating hold on Avdeevka has been evident for several weeks. Ukraine recently rotated out soldiers from the 110th Brigade, which had played a vital role in the defense of the city for 2 years, but were exhausted and severely depleted after months of brutal combat. So more or less beginning in October last year, when Russia really began focusing on Avdeevka. Soldiers from the elite 3rd Assault Brigade were sent in to shore up Ukraine's forces, but noted that they were being sent into a situation that was already extremely critical. Avdeevka is held, the brigade's commander, Andrei Belinsky said in a statement, Andrei Belinsky, that name sounds very familiar. Where have we heard this name before? I will get to that in just a moment. But the article continues. The situation in the city was precarious and unstable, he said, with the Russians able to rotate troops and deploy more resources to the fight. So this is an admission that Russia has advantages in manpower, equipment, firepower, everything that we have been saying for the last 2 years. Now, finally, everyone in the West is admitting to all of this. There's no possible way to cover this up any longer. And this was actually Russia's main objective. It was not to take territory. It was not to storm the city and take it for the sake of increasing their territorial control. It was to critically weaken and continuously exhaust the Ukraine military, an effort to destroy manpower, equipment, and force Ukraine to expend ammunition faster than it could be reconstituted. And that is exactly what has happened. And this is the problem Western analysts, Western political and military leaders, the Western media, this is the problem they have when analyzing this conflict in Ukraine. They're only thinking in 3 dimensions, the here and now, up, down, left, right, forward, backwards. This is all they're looking at. And they're looking at it in the sense of territorial control. But you need to add the 4th dimension of time. You have to think about the past, the present, and where all of this is headed in the future. And if you do that, you can very clearly see what Russia is doing. Why should Russia conduct an offensive against well-prepared, dug-in, well-supplied Ukrainian forces if they have the ability to grind them down first and then launch an offensive? Why would they do the first rather than the second? They would conserve their manpower and equipment, wear down the Ukrainians, and then by the time it came to launch an offensive, or as it came time to start pushing and taking territory, Ukrainians would be significantly weakened. You would not be hitting up against a steel wall like the Ukrainians did last year during their offensive. You would be rolling over the broken army and defenses of the Ukrainian military. Russia is attempting to weaken Ukraine, not only to create a collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity locally in places like Avdeevka, allowing Russia to inevitably take the city. They are doing this across the entire line of contact. They want to precipitate a total collapse of Ukrainian fighting capacity. That is what their goal is, and they are well on their way to achieving it. Now, I want to get back to the New York Times citing the 3rd Assault Brigade's commander, Andrei Belinsky. The 3rd Assault Brigade is the rebranding of the Nazi Azov Battalion. And Belinsky himself has been mentioned many times throughout the Western media since 2014. He is a notorious figure in Ukrainian politics and now also in Ukrainian military matters. He is an unrepentant neo-Nazi and anti-Semite. He is an extremist, and yet the New York Times omits any mention of this at all. And the 3rd Assault Brigade is still very much driven by Nazism. Their uniforms, their flags, the insignia is still a reworked version of the Nazi Wolf's Angle. So before I get into exposing the New York Times for covering this up or attempting to just gloss over it, I also want to lump somebody else in to all of this. I want to bring up this from an organization called Vox Ukraine. And they published an article by their Vox Czech team on February 9th, 2024. And it's titled "The Network of Russian Propaganda: What Connects Western Experts Promoting Narratives Beneficial to Russia." So is that all it takes to be considered a Russian propagandist? If you're promoting narratives beneficial to Russia, what if the truth is beneficial to Russia? And by speaking the truth, does that then somehow make you a Russian propagandist? And I'm bringing this up. There's many lists out there that Ukraine has created. The very famous Peacemaker kill list. There's an official Ukrainian government propaganda list, and now this Vox Czech list. And you can see there's many very, very prominent people on here: Tucker Carlson, Professor John Mearsheimer, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, renowned journalist Pepe Escobar, Max Blumenthal, you have Ray McGovern, you have Glenn Greenwald, Jimmy Dore, Larry Johnson, many very prominent people here. And here I am, Brian Berletic, right down here, right here. I'm very flattered to be included on this list, but also more seriously, I'm concerned because this will be the second list that I've made it on in regards to my coverage of Ukraine. And this is what they say about me in this article. They say, former Marine Brian Berletic describes himself as a geopolitical analyst and also has his own YouTube channel, The New Atlas. Berletic claims that the Ukrainian government uses Nazi military units to suppress pro-Russian sentiments among Ukrainians. He also accuses fighters from the Azov, Adar, and Right Sector units of terrorizing civilians. Additionally, he promotes Russian narratives such as Ukraine's victory is impossible and the US has started a war in Ukraine. Now, I just got done reading from the New York Times admitting that Ukraine is losing Avdeevka, and this is part of a larger crisis across the Ukrainian military where they're out of manpower, equipment, and ammunition. And Russia is stronger than ever. So is it Russian propaganda to say Ukraine's victory is impossible, or is that just demonstrably true? Now, regarding Nazism in Ukraine, not just the accusations made by Vox Ukraine, but also in regards to the New York Times mentioning the 3rd Assault Brigade and also Andrei Belinsky, but never mentioning that they are notorious Nazis. Let's go over some of the articles over the years that have admitted all of this. And please note that all of these sources are from the Western media. So let's begin with this one from the Telegraph. And you'll notice that this is the archived version, because what the Telegraph ended up doing is going back and deleting this article. They deleted this article, and I think once you look at it, you'll understand why, because this is what the Western media has been doing across the board. They are whitewashing, covering up, and deleting their previous coverage of Nazism in Ukraine. Ukraine crisis, the neo-Nazi brigade fighting pro-Russian separatists. Kiev throws paramilitary, some openly neo-Nazi, into the front of the battle with rebels. And who are they talking about? Azov Battalion. This is what the article says. Azov men use the neo-Nazi wolf's angle, wolf's hook symbol on their banner, and members of the battalion are openly white supremacists or anti-Semites. Then it talks about Belinsky as the Azov Battalion's commander, and it talks about his background. It says, a former history student and amateur boxer, Mr. Belinsky is also head of an extremist Ukrainian group called Social National Assembly. The historic mission of our nation is at this critical moment is to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade for their survival, he wrote in a recent commentary. A crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen, which is German for subhumans. And he's using this word because he is a Nazi, and he has modeled himself and his organization, the Azov Battalion, and also these other organizations that he heads or had headed. He has modeled them after Nazi Germany. Now, again, you can see why the Telegraph went back and deleted this article, because now that this conflict is taking place, and one of the main reasons Russia says it launched this special military operation is because the US, the rest of NATO, were building up an army of Nazis on their border, which is a legitimate national security concern. I think that is the reason why they are erasing articles like this, because they understand that if people looked at this and then listened to Russian President Vladimir Putin cite Nazism on his border as a national security threat, I think they would find that somewhat reasonable. Here's an article from the BBC. I'm going to overdo this because I think it is really important for people to see just how extensively the Western media documented Nazism in Ukraine before 2022, when they began burying it, whitewashing it, or just scrubbing it from history. Ukraine underplays role of far right in conflict. Well, now it's the Western media underplaying the role of the far right in the conflict. This was from December 2014. And this article also identifies Belinsky as the Azov battalion commander. It says Interior Minister Arsen Avakov and his deputy Anton Goroshenko actively supported the parliament candidacy of Andrei Belinsky, the Azov and Patriot of Ukraine commander. So Patriot of Ukraine is another Nazi organization. So we always hear about how the actual Nazis have a very tiny representation within the Ukrainian government. But as the BBC just admitted, everyone else in the Ukrainian government supports the Nazis. So if you're supporting the Nazis, and you're incorporating them into your military, and you're providing them with a budget and with weapons and with directives, how are you not also a Nazi? How are you not also at least pro-Nazi, complicit in supporting Nazis? Then the BBC explains what Azov is specifically. Run by extremist Patriot of Ukraine organization, this organization Belinsky also headed, which considers Jews and other minorities subhuman and calls for a white Christian crusade against them. It sports 3 Nazi symbols on its insignia: a modified wolf's hook, a black sun, and the title Black Corps, which was used by the Waffen-SS. So their original logo was actually 3 Nazi logos put together, and then they were told by someone obviously to tone it down. So if you look at their logo today, you will notice that it's a reworked wolf's angle. It's still a Nazi symbol, but they've reworked it so that it's not as obvious. Here's another article. Mark Sloboda, who's also a geopolitical analyst and covering this conflict very closely, and whose analysis I highly value, he actually personally sent this to remind me that even the US government's Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty media platform covered this. Not 2014, this was actually 2018. So they're admitting that the problem is only growing. It says, Azov, Ukraine's most prominent ultranationalist group, sets its sights on US, Europe. So it is a problem consuming Ukraine, and it is a problem spreading out from Ukraine's borders. This is what the article admits. It says, Washington has armed Ukraine with Javelin anti-tank missile systems and trained its armed forces as they fight Russian-backed separatists in the east. But it has banned arms going to Azov members and forbidden them from participating in US-led military training because of their far-right ideology. Well, this is something that was later reversed. Not because Azov aren't Nazis, but because the US government just wanted to appear to be opposed to Nazism, when all along, very deliberately, they were using Nazis in Ukraine to politically capture the country in 2014 and then feed it into this proxy war that is taking place right now. It also says the Azov battalion flaunts a symbol similar to that of former Nazi Wolfsangel. It has been accused by international human rights groups such as the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights of committing and allowing serious human rights abuses, including torture. So let's go back to what I was accused of by Vox Ukraine. The Ukrainian government uses Nazi military units to suppress pro-Russian sentiments among Ukrainians. Also accuses fighters from the Azov, Adar, and Right Sector units of terrorizing civilians. Well, the UN's human rights organization says that they're terrorizing and torturing people. So again, this is not Russian propaganda. This is me, and this has been me citing solely the Western media regarding these facts. These are facts about Azov. Yes, these facts are very convenient for Russian foreign policy objectives. Their objective is to eliminate Nazism along their border in Ukraine. And it just so happens that there are literally armed Nazis in Ukraine, right on Russia's border. Then the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty article admits that just within 4 years, the Azov movement has become a small state inside the state. Much of the success has come from recruiting new, mostly young members who it hopes will come to the polls in next year's parliamentary elections. Azov has done so with youth camps, including some that teach children as young as 9 years old military tactics and far-right ideology, recreation centers, lecture halls, and far-right education programs. So this is all being done to radicalize a larger and larger percentage of the Ukrainian population. And again, the West has done entire documentaries on this, and I have covered this. And my sole source has been the Western media regarding Nazism in Ukraine. So even though the main point of the New York Times article is that Ukraine is losing Avdeevka, I wanted to point out how the New York Times and the rest of the Western media is trying to cover up the true nature of the Ukrainian forces fighting in and around Avdeevka and along the entire line of contact, and the true nature of this conflict in general. This is very important to keep in mind as this conflict continues and as the West tries to generate reasons, pretexts, justification for continuing this conflict, when in reality what they are doing is waging a proxy war against Russia, using the most extremist elements within Ukrainian society, who then are coercing the rest of Ukrainian society to go along in terms of this proxy war, this highly destructive proxy war. Now, beyond Avdeevka, Russia's strategy of aggressive attrition is also working. There is an overall collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity, and we get this from articles like this. This is from CNN, February 10th, 2024. Outmanned and outgunned, Ukraine's new army chief faces big challenge in taking the fight to Russia. President Volodymyr Zelensky replaced General Valery Zaluzhny after days of rumor and speculation and months of a fraying relationship. The announcement comes at a critical moment in the war with Russia and is likely to herald a change in Ukrainian strategy, but it is also hazardous. No, that is not true, but I will explain that in just a moment. The removal of Zaluzhny from his position as commander-in-chief comes as Ukrainian units are on the back foot in several parts of the long front line. So I just said it's not just Avdeevka, it's the entire line of contact. CNN is admitting this. And it says especially in eastern Donetsk and Kharkov regions, they are desperately short of shells and other munitions and running short of experienced soldiers. It's unlikely that Zaluzhny's replacement, General Alexander Syrsky, will offer a radical change of style, but he is thought to be closer to Zelensky. So they're obliquely admitting that the whole change of leadership was motivated by politics. It has nothing to do with strategy, tactics, or improving the prospect of Ukraine winning this conflict. They are not. They are going to lose. They're going to lose for all the same reasons they were losing under Zaluzhny. They have no more manpower. They have no more equipment. They have no more ammunition. They are out of all of these things. They have enough to perpetuate the bloodshed, but they do not have enough to change the balance of power on the battlefield and the ultimate trajectory of this conflict. Now, we all know that Ukraine is a proxy of the United States and, to a lesser degree, the rest of NATO. We know that. We know the whole reason Ukraine is fighting this conflict is because the US maneuvered them into this conflict very deliberately to fight Russia on the US and NATO's behalf. Everyone in Ukraine's political and military leadership are simply carrying out directives they are given by the West. And the only reason the West would want to remove a political or military leader out of their position is if they were not listening. If they were being told to do something and they were refusing to do it, or they were complicating it unnecessarily. If this is the reason they removed General Zaluzhny, I would not be surprised, although, again, this is just speculation. We really don't know what the true story is, but this reflects a problem the United States has always had throughout the decades, building up client regimes around the world, building up opposition groups within targeted countries. The only type of people who would sign up to become accomplices in US meddling around the globe, especially inside their own country, are people who are fundamentally incompetent, unreliable. If these are the only kind of people you can get to sign on to your political interference, your political capture of a targeted nation, you're always going to run into these type of problems. People who are competent, people who are reliable, these are people who would most likely want to serve the best interests of their country. The article continues. Syrsky has been in command of land forces since the Russian invasion, but was criticized for extending the defense of Bakhmut at great human cost. Subordinates have described him as lacking empathy, and some soldiers took to calling him General 200. 200 is the military code for killed in action. This is CNN admitting that Ukrainian General Syrskyi is doing all of the things that the Western media has been accusing Russia of throughout the duration of this conflict. Then the article talks about the challenges Ukraine's forces face. It says frontline units in several vulnerable areas told CNN in recent weeks that they were often chronically short of ammunition, particularly Western 155mm artillery shells. At one gun position, troops were resupplied with smoke shells after exhausting their high explosive ammunition, they said. It's better than no shells, one soldier said. The head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Lieutenant General Kirill Bundanov, told CNN that at the end of January, that ammunition is one of the most decisive factors in the war. With the Biden administration's package of $61 billion in military aid blocked in Congress, the U.S. has been sending smaller packages for several months, and the slowdown has already begun affecting Ukrainian military planning and operations, according to U.S. officials. And I'm sure that that's true to a certain extent. But if you've been following my analysis over the last 2 years, you'll have noticed that even long before the funding dried up, those packages were getting smaller, because it is not a matter of money available. It's a matter of the physical weapons and ammunition. They are in critically short supply. Western military industrial output cannot create enough of them fast enough. And so it does not matter how much money you have. Alex Christoforou of the Duran said it perfectly. He said it wouldn't matter if it was $61 billion or $600 billion. There is no ammunition to buy in sufficient numbers. There is not. Avdeevka would have fallen regardless of whether this was passed. This is just an excuse. And when you really think about it, this is actually the perfect off-ramp for the United States. If US policymakers were smart, they would use this appearance of political deadlock as an excuse to just cut Ukraine off and let it float away. This is the perfect way to make it look like it was political deadlock and not simply fundamental American weakness that led to Ukraine's defeat in this proxy war. Then the article says Zaluzhny has persistently argued that given Russia's higher pool of manpower and armor, Ukraine needs to a step change in its battlefield technology. More sophisticated drones and other unmanned systems would provide real-time intelligence and accurate targeting information. For example, in his recent essay, Zaluzhny suggested that turbocharging such investment, as well as embracing cyber technology, could produce results within 5 months. But I've already explained why this is an utter fantasy. Russia is just as capable of developing any of these capabilities, and they're capable of doing it on vastly larger scales. And the CNN article even admits that Russia holds a significant advantage in drone and electronic warfare. They already have a significant advantage, and they continue to expand this advantage. The best that Ukraine and the collective West could do is just try to keep that gap stable rather than continuously expanding. Then the article continues. It says, the immediate future, Ukrainian leadership must show unity after what has been a messy changeover. This is Podolyak, an advisor to the office of the president. He said that during a war, political competition, especially at the level of the army, generals, and politicians, doesn't look so good. Instilling a new sense of purpose in all is all the more important as Ukraine faces a window of vulnerability. As Matthew Schmidt, director of the International Affairs Program at the University of New Haven in Connecticut, as he puts it, Putin can throw bodies at the enemy using Russian quantity to overcome Ukrainian quality. It's a very Stalinist approach to the battlefield, and it's built into Russian strategic culture. But again, as the article itself points out, Russia not only has a quantitative edge, it has a qualitative edge. They even cite electronic warfare and drone warfare as an example of where Russia excels, not just in terms of quantity, but also the quality of their weapon systems are simply superior to that of Ukraine and the Western equipment transferred to Ukraine. What are they actually talking about then? They're not talking about changing the dynamics on the battlefield. They're simply talking about managing public perception regarding what is unfolding on the battlefield. Experts like Matthew Schmidt, and as I've pointed out, like so many other Western analysts, they have this misconception that the West and Ukraine, they have this huge advantage in terms of quality, while Russia has an advantage in quantity. And in general, Ukraine is a better fighting force than Russia, but it just simply isn't true. And I've always tried to explain that in World War II, Nazi Germany had the same mindset. They had tanks that were meticulously assembled, over-engineered. Just an example of one sitting next to its Soviet counterpart, you could see all of the time and effort and energy and also money put into that tank. It is manufactured and designed in ways far superior to the Russian tank. Superficially, fundamentally, the tanks may have had a slight advantage over their Russian counterparts. Sometimes the Russian tanks were superior in terms of firepower, mobility, and armor. And then in addition to that, because the Soviet Union was mass producing these and they were cutting corners, they did not care if it looked beautiful. They did not care if there were welds, gaps in the welding that you could fit your hand through. What mattered was quantity, because quantity has a quality. And if you have tanks that are about the same quality as a German tank, and maybe in some areas a little less so, especially superficially, but you have many, many more of them, because the tank is designed to be made cheaply and quickly and in vast numbers, then that is a benefit to its design, not a detraction from it. And we see the same process unfolding today, where the West has these extremely expensive, over-engineered weapon systems that either perform as well as Russian systems or sometimes worse than Russian systems, plus they're just made in far too few numbers to make any difference. And because CNN mentioned it in their article, I think it's worth focusing some more on military industrial capacity and how it adds up between both sides. So we have an article from Al Jazeera. For Ukraine's defense industry goals against Russia, the sky's the limit. That's a very optimistic headline. To defeat Russia's might and allies' political flicker, Ukraine wants to build the defense workshop of the world. This is February 12th, 2024. So despite seeing everything that we have all seen up until now, they still believe that it's a viable option to build massive military industrial facilities inside Ukraine, despite Russia having completely wiped out Ukraine's military industrial capacity and maintaining the capability to continue doing so with massive numbers of long-range cruise missiles that can hit targets anywhere within Ukraine's current borders. The article says, as Ukraine approaches the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, it plans to produce more of its own ammunition and key weapon systems. The goal of greater self-sufficiency comes as Ukraine's Western allies meet increasing political resistance to military aid, and Russia ramps up weapons production. I will get more into that in just a moment. Last month, Ukraine's prime minister said that the country plans to increase its domestic weapons production sixfold this year. Which, when you just read that, it sounds like a lot, but what if your production numbers are next to zero? You increase it by sixfold, it's still nearly zero. Ukraine's defense industry has already begun to expand. Strategic Industries Minister Alexander Kamyashin said Ukraine last year doubled its ammunition production for NATO caliber artillery systems. So what if they were just making 1,000 rounds a month? And now they've doubled it to 2,000 rounds a month. They're firing 6,000 to 7,000 rounds per day. They don't give any numbers, and I believe that that's very deliberate. Then the article says President Volodymyr Zelensky said it had produced 3 times more equipment and weapons than in the first year of the war. That included armored vehicles and anti-tank missile systems. But it's in unmanned systems that Ukraine aims to be a global pioneer. Almost 200 companies produced drones in Ukraine last year, up from 7 in 2022, and their production increased 100-fold. Again, they're talking about how many times production increased, but they're not talking about any quantity. From what quantity have they increased 100-fold from? And as I have pointed out in recent articles about drone warfare in Ukraine, the Western media admits that at a minimum, Russia enjoys a 2-to-1 advantage in terms of the quantity of drones flying over the battlefield. They also admit that Russian drones are superior. They also admit that Russia has superior electronic warfare, which means if only a certain percentage of these drones get through on either side, the fact that Russia also has electronic warfare means the percentage for Ukraine will actually be even lower. Then the article talks about these drone strikes that Ukraine has carried out across Russia, including in Crimea. And as we've pointed out, and as even the Western media has admitted, these are symbolic. This is for public relations. It has no impact, even tactically, let alone strategically, on the ongoing battle. They talk about these surface drones hitting Russian ships, but this is a land war. And most of Russia's Black Sea fleet is out of range of these drones, and their role is firing cruise missiles, which can hit targets inside Ukraine, no matter where they are in the Black Sea. So again, this is them grasping at straws to try to portray this as less desperate than it actually is. Then the article switches back to much larger weapon systems and plans to build these factories in Ukraine. It says, Turkish drone manufacturer Bayraktar recently revealed it was building a factory in Ukraine to produce about 120 drones a year. When was the last time you've heard about the TB2 Bayraktar drone? I haven't heard anything about it recently, and the few stories that we had heard toward the beginning of the conflict, again, this was them trying to spin symbolic success as some sort of strategic victory when in reality it wasn't, and these drones were being shot down in large numbers and rendered essentially useless over the battlefield. So they're going to make 120 of these per year. Germany's Rheinmetall, among the world's 30 largest defense industries, last year established a joint venture to build armored vehicles in Ukraine to assure its strategic autonomy. Finnish armored vehicle maker Patria is also said to be considering a joint venture in Ukraine. Others may follow, including Belgium and France. United States President Joe Biden met with the leaders of venture capital firms at the White House last month and encouraged investment in Ukraine. Well, this is a lot of talk about building factories. Are these factories going to be built, and how long will they last until a Russian cruise missile finds them? This is the reality that they're omitting from articles like this, and they have been consistently doing this. But I want you to consider this fact. Even if somehow they were able to establish factories in Ukraine, we are watching the collective West struggle, even within their own borders, to increase military industrial output. These are under the most ideal conditions. How is Ukraine within their borders in the middle of a conflict like this? How are they going to succeed where the collective West has failed? So again, you can just see how irrational and fantastical this whole narrative actually is. Now, I also saw some articles recently about attempts by Western arms manufacturers to increase production, to increase weapon shipments to Ukraine. So the first one comes from the Norwegian government. This is their official website. Norway provide more NASAMS to Ukraine. So NASAMS is an air defense system that fires air-to-air missiles that are used for a surface-to-air role. It says the government proposes to the Norwegian parliament to order a further 10 launch units and 4 fire control centers of the air defense system NASAMS from Kongsberg Defense and Aerospace. This is done in addition to repurchasing the equipment that has already been donated to Ukraine. The investment is 3.45 billion in Norway's currency. No information is given about when these systems will be sent to Ukraine. What is the timeline? So you're going to send 10. That sounds great. When are they going to get to Ukraine? If you dig for information about lead times regarding the production of NASAMS, the actual launchers and control centers, you might find articles like this. This is from Defense News. December 2022, Raytheon wins $1.2 billion surface-to-air missile order for Ukraine. And this article says the U.S. Army awarded Raytheon Missile and Defense a contract worth as much as $1.2 million, $1.2 billion to deliver 6 National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System batteries for Ukraine. The contract is part of the 5th Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative package and includes training and logistical support to Ukraine's military and security forces, the Army said in a November 30th, 2022 statement. Now, the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative covers arms that are being ordered from manufacturers. These are not weapons that are sitting around in stockpiles to be sent. They have to be manufactured and then sent. And the article says the first 2 NASAMS batteries capable of firing AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles have been delivered and deployed and have successfully demonstrated the effectiveness of the system against the threat, according to the Army. Pentagon officials have said the first NASAMS were able to be purchased quickly because the bulk of the systems had already been produced. So they were just sitting around and they sent them to Ukraine. But then it says it takes 24 months lead time to produce and deliver NASAMS, though the Army and industry are looking for ways to shorten that timeline. So 2 years to produce these systems, but at what production rate? Because if it's 2 years to produce, say, between 3 and 5, and you want to produce 10, you're not going to produce 10 within 2 years. They never say. They never say what the production rate is. And they deliberately leave out these timelines because if you saw the timeline, you would realize how behind the entire West is and how incapable they are of supplying weapons to Ukraine faster than Russia can either exhaust or destroy them. What about 155 millimeter artillery shells? I've talked a lot about this, and I saw this from Rheinmetall. It wins major artillery ammunition order for Ukraine worth over 140 million euros. And this is actually from December last year, but I recently saw channels on Telegram reporting on it again. It says Rheinmetall plans a massive increase in ammunition production capacity in 2024 at its plants in Germany, Spain, South Africa, and Australia, bringing annual output capacity to around 700,000 artillery rounds. So let's put that number into perspective. Russia, as of 2023-2024, is believed to be producing over 2 million rounds per year, or somewhere around 200,000 rounds per month. So Rheinmetall would be producing somewhere around 59,000 rounds per month by 2025. And if every single round Rheinmetall produced went to Ukraine, along with the US Army's target of 80,000 rounds per month by 2025, combined, that would be 140,000 rounds per month versus Russia producing over 200,000 rounds right now. And by 2025, almost certainly producing more than that even. The real question, though, that we have to ask ourselves is we hear plans by Rheinmetall, by the US Army, at their plants that they own in the United States, these plans to expand production to these numbers. Do they have plans beyond that to expand even further? In order to expand production at the rate the United States is expanding production, trying to achieve between 80,000 to 100,000 shells per month, they are building entirely new facilities, entire buildings, facilities, and expanding existing facilities to do this. Once they reach 80 to 100,000 rounds per month, in order to expand even further, if they're already maxing out production, that means they would have to invest in even more facilities. These two examples, NASAMS and 155 millimeter artillery shells, show how even in the West, under ideal conditions, they are unable to sufficiently expand weapons and ammunition production. So how is Ukraine going to do that within its own borders? By building factories. Where are they getting the skilled manpower to operate these factories? You can see how absurd this whole narrative actually is. And why are they spinning these narratives if they're so ridiculous? Why are they trying to maintain hope in the minds of people around the world? They want to keep this conflict going for as long as possible, as long as profitable, no matter what it costs Ukraine, because the United States is not incurring any costs. The arms industry in the United States are making huge sums of money. massive profits, it's Ukraine, it's its people, it's its economy, its infrastructure. They're the ones paying the price the longer this conflict goes. The way the United States and the rest of NATO see this, this is a means of raising the cost, even if Russia is going to succeed, raising the cost as high as possible. And they don't care what ultimately happens to Ukraine. When you consider that, we continuously hear what a threat Russia poses to Ukraine, but when you really think about the truth behind US foreign policy in regards to Ukraine, it is the United States that is the greatest threat to Ukraine, its self-preservation. Very clearly, not Russia. In addition to all of these other weapon systems, and because Al Jazeera was focusing on drones, I heard Alex Christoforou talking about NATO plans to manufacture 1 million drones a year for Ukraine. When you just hear that, sounds like a lot. Ukraine has promised 1 million drones within a year by allies. Ukraine struggles with ammunition shortages, US aid blocked. Latvia's defense minister speaks in interview with Bloomberg. So, what are they trying to do? They're trying to use first-person view kamikaze drones as a substitute for artillery. It says a coalition of allies aim to deliver 1 million drones to Ukraine within a year, as the country struggles to cope with ammunition shortages and a funding fight in Washington. The primary task at the moment is to supply Ukraine with these very necessary technologies, also to tilt the balance, especially in the context when there is still some shortages of ammunition. This was Latvia's defense minister saying this in an interview. So can 1 million FPV drones transferred over to Ukraine over the course of a year, can that actually tilt the balance? And the answer is no. First of all, first-person view kamikaze drones are not a substitute for artillery shells. They do not have the area effect that artillery shells have. They do not have the range that artillery shells have. They do not have the speed to reach their targets that artillery shells have. They are not a substitute for artillery shells. They have a role on the battlefield. If you're drawing them off from that purpose to augment very poorly your artillery shell ammunition shortages, you've now taken one deficiency and created two. Second of all, Russia is already producing by far more than 1 million drones a year. And we know this because Eric Schmidt, who is building a company in an attempt to deliver drones to Ukraine, he admitted this in his article in Foreign Affairs. Ukraine is losing the drone war. How Kiev can close the innovation gap with Russia. And this is all built on the premise that the West is able to out-innovate Russia. There's no evidence to suggest that they can, but what he admits is this in his article. Russia has ramped up its military offensives in spite of the harsh winter weather, and increased production capacity has played a big role in the latest advance. Ukrainian officials estimate that Russia can now produce or procure around 100,000 drones per month, whereas Ukraine can only churn out half that amount. And this is Ukraine making this claim. Is it 100,000? Is it more than 100,000? But let's just say it is 100,000. That is 1.2 million drones a year. And as Europe plans to transfer 1 million drones in a year to Ukraine, is Russia going to sit idle, or is this going to compel them to expand production of drones even more so? And speaking of growing Russian military industrial outputs, I saw this article from The Guardian. A lot higher than we expected. Russian arms production worries Europe's war planners. This was February 15th, 2024. Moscow has massively ramped up its industry, giving it advantages in Ukraine and leading to a redistribution of wealth. As Ukraine has scrambled to source ammunition, arms, and equipment for its defense, Russia has presided over a massive ramping up of industrial production over the last 2 years that has outstripped what many Western defense planners expected when Vladimir Putin launched his invasion. Total defense spending has risen to an estimated 7.5% of Russia's GDP. Supply chains have been redesigned to secure many key inputs and evade sanctions. And factories producing ammunition, vehicles, and equipment are running around the clock, often on mandatory 12-hour shifts with double overtime, in order to sustain the Russian war machine for the foreseeable future. Then they get into some of the production numbers. One key indicator in the artillery war has been the domestic manufacture of shells, which experts put at 2.5 to 5 million units a year. They're citing the deputy director in the policy planning department of Estonia's defense minister, Mark Risik. Says Risik called the trend worrying, noting that production could run above 4 million units in the next year or two. The import of more than 1 million shells already from North Korea, a strategic stockpile of shells in the millions, gives Russia an additional cushion. While that number may not give Russia the needed capacity to make significant territorial gains in 2024 and 2025, there we go again with this obsession with territorial gain, it nonetheless puts Ukraine at a significant disadvantage on the front lines, where Russia has at least a 3-to-1 superiority in artillery fire, and often more than that. It's a lot higher than we expected, really, Risik says, of the Russian production numbers. And we've heard one article after the other admitting this piecemeal over the last couple of months. So how's all of this possible? How is it that Russia was able to achieve this? Well, The Guardian explains. It says much of this was baked into Russia's military-industrial complex, a sprawling behemoth of nearly 6,000 companies, many of which rarely turned a profit before the war. But what it lacked in efficiency, it made up in spare capacity and flexibility when the Russian government suddenly ramped up defense production in 2022. So the West ruthlessly slashed excess capacity because it's not profitable, and every industry in the West exists solely to maximize profits, even if it comes at the expense of fulfilling its purpose for Western society. So the Western pharmaceutical industry, for example, by maximizing profits, is actually making people sicker, not healthier, and also bankrupting people in the process. And the military-industrial complex in the West, because it maximizes profits, doesn't care about excess production. It only cares about how they can make more money quarter to quarter. So they've slashed excess capacity, and that is something you cannot build overnight. And I've talked about this endlessly over the last 2 years. And here's The Guardian finally explaining it to its readers. This is all about profit-driven economies versus purpose-driven economies. Russia's economy is purpose-driven. Its defense industry is purpose-driven. They were making weapons and ammunition not because it was profitable, but because they needed it for national defense. And by the way, as the US is running into these problems with Russia, which has less than half the population of the US, China is also a purpose-driven economy, and their defense industry works in very much the same way. Just keep that in mind. And then this report talks about armored vehicles, and this gets into another point I want to address again. Russian factories claim to have delivered 1,500 main battle tanks this year, of which 1,180 to 1,280 had been reactivated from storage, according to IISS. Those numbers, along with reactivated armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, meant Russia would have to be able to sustain its assault on Ukraine at the current attrition rates for another 2 to 3 years, or maybe even longer, the group said. But then the article also claims that Russia has lost over 8,800 armored vehicles, which clearly is impossible. And let me get into that, because where are they getting these numbers from? And what did those numbers serve? If they don't reflect reality, why were these numbers being published all across the Western media for the last 2 years? And it was essentially war propaganda. It was to depict the Russians as being in a hopeless situation, poorly led, poorly equipped, poorly trained, poorly supplied, and that they would inevitably fail in their special military operation in Ukraine. Reuters also was talking about this recently. This is their article here, making exactly the same point. February 13th, 2024, Russia relying on old stocks after losing 3,000 tanks in Ukraine, leading military research center says. Russia has lost more than 3,000 tanks during its invasion of Ukraine, the equivalent of its entire pre-war active inventory, but has enough lower quality armored vehicles in storage for years of replacements, a leading research center said. Ukraine has also suffered heavy losses since the invasion began in February 2022, but Western military replenishments have allowed it to maintain inventories while upgrading quality, the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies said in its annual military balance report. So IISS mentioned by The Guardian. Reuters is also citing them. It's another one of these Western think tanks funded by Western corporate financier interests and Western governments. Reuters continues, it says, Russia has an active force of 1,750 main battle tanks, ranging from decades-old T-55s to its modern T-80s and T-90s. The military balance said. This is a report put out by IISS, the military balance. It has a further 4,000 in storage. The situation underscored a growing feeling of a stalemate in the fighting that may persist through 2024, military balance said. But again, this is not a stalemate. Russia has chosen a very deliberate strategy of attrition. They're not trying to take territory. They're trying to grind down Ukraine's military. And by all accounts, all across the Western media, Russia is succeeding in that strategy. They are admitting that Ukraine's military is being ground down to the point of collapse, as we see in Avdeevka and in other places along the line of contact. But Reuters twists it around, and they say that it's Ukraine waging the war of attrition. They're grinding down the Russian military. With the conflict about to enter its third year, Ukraine's commanders have signaled they are prepared to keep grinding down Russia's forces across the 1,000-kilometer front. In an interview with Reuters in January, then Ground Forces Commander Alexander Syrsky said defense remained the priority, even as he did not rule out further offensive operations. Our goal remains unchanged, holding our positions, exhausting the enemy by inflicting maximum losses, said Syrsky, who last week replaced Valery Zaluzhny, the popular leader of Ukraine's forces, through the darkest days of the invasion. The article never talks about how many tanks Ukraine has. They completely omit that. They talk about how many tanks Russia has, how many they supposedly lost. They never talk about the actual numbers of Ukrainian tanks. But IISS, in their actual report, if you go to it, and I did, and the link to it will be in the video description below. Here it is. Equipment losses in Russia's war on Ukraine mount. As Russia's losses in the war on Ukraine continue to grow, the IISS assess how long Moscow can sustain its current rate of equipment attrition. So even at these astronomical numbers they're claiming Russia is losing equipment at, they still say Russia could continue fighting on at this rate for years into the future. Can Ukraine? So this is what this IISS report actually says. Well, this is introducing the report. You actually have to pay money to read the full report. The IISS, so they're telling you where they get the information regarding Russian vehicle losses. IISS cross-referenced indicated losses from imagery with other information sources, including Pentagon data leaks in 2023, which we've all gone over and talked about how absurd that they were and how they did not reflect reality in any shape, form, or way. Open source trackers, including Oryx, interviews, and reports. Oryx, the so-called open source intelligence project, which shuttered its website, or at least the majority of people working on it disappeared in the middle of the offensive, because the 2023 Ukrainian offensive demonstrated to the whole world that Oryx numbers were propaganda. They were not true, not even close. If Oryx numbers were true, Ukraine's military would have rolled right over Russian defenses. And as a matter of fact, if you remember, in the lead up to Ukraine's offensive, people were citing Oryx to explain why Ukraine's offensive would be so successful, that Russian forces were depleted, all of their best tanks are gone, all their best troops are gone, and there were beaten, poorly trained, poorly led, poorly equipped Russian soldiers shivering in their trenches, and they would just be rolled over by Ukraine's offensive. And the exact opposite happened. And so Oryx Most of the Oryx team disappeared because the game was up, and yet they're still citing Oryx to this day. This is what the IISS says about Ukrainian tank numbers. This is interesting. The situation for Ukraine's land force equipment evolution is also opaque. In some cases, even more so because open source imagery of battlefield losses is skewed on the Russian side. A detailed recording of available information on losses, as well as on new equipment deliveries from Western supporters of Kiev, support our judgment of Ukraine's current inventory. In some cases where information on vehicles has not been available for months, we opted not to include detailed numbers because of the uncertainty over their operational status. Then the report claims, overall, we estimate that 2 years after the full-scale invasion, the number of main battle tanks in service in the Ukrainian armed forces remains near pre-war levels, while the number of APCs and infantry fighting vehicles has increased thanks to Western support. How could that possibly be? How could that be possible? Just look at the battlefield. Look at what's taking place in Avdeevka. If Russia's military has been ground down to nothing, and Ukraine has more now than they did at the beginning of the conflict, how come it looks like Russia has more now than it did in the beginning, and Ukraine is out of everything? How come it actually looks like that on the battlefield? It does not add up. It clearly doesn't add up, and IISS in their report cannot explain why it doesn't add up. But they are referring to conclusions drawn from Oryx, Oryx's supposed database, but they do not want to repeat what these conclusions are, because at this point, if they included it in their report, I think people would see through it. But if you go to older articles like this from the Moscow Times, which is actually not a Russian publication, is a Western publication. This is from July 2023. Ukraine's tank numbers now equal Russia's analysis. Again, utterly absurd. And it says, according to the Kiel Institute's Ukraine support tracker, that sounds very objective, Russia has lost over 2,000 of the 3,417 tanks which it used to invade Ukraine in February 2022. Oryx, there we go, Oryx again. Oryx estimates that the Russian army now has about 1,400 tanks remaining. Ukraine, in comparison, has lost 550 tanks of its original 987 tanks. Do you believe that Russia lost over 2,000 tanks, Ukraine has only lost 550 tanks? Does anyone actually believe that at this point? Then the article says Ukraine managed to capture 545 Russian tanks, according to Oryx. Western allies have transferred 471 tanks to Kiev, with an additional 286 expected to arrive soon. In total, Ukrainian armed forces are estimated to have approximately 1,500 tanks. What we see along the line of contact, does that look like an army with 1,500 tanks? Does that look like an army with a similar number or greater number of tanks than Russia? Clearly not. And it's not just recently. Russia has been outfighting Ukraine throughout the entire duration of this conflict. When they talk about the battle for Kiev or the Kharkov and Kherson offensive, people forget what actually was going on at the time on the ground. It was not Ukraine outfighting Russia. Russian forces voluntarily withdrew from around Kiev. They had already been withdrawing from Kharkov. There was a very small number of Russian troops in the area when Ukraine launched their offensive. It's very smart to launch an offensive and to take territory where your enemy is weakest, but hardly any Russian forces were there. And that's why they were successful. The moment they met Russian forces determined to hold their position, the offensive ground to a halt. And then we remember around Kherson, we always hear about how Ukraine took Kherson from Russia, but we remember that Russia actually made the decision to withdraw from Kherson. And we remember even the Western media admitting what an orderly retreat that was, and how Ukraine failed to inflict large casualties on the retreating forces. And we also remember, before that took place, before Russia withdrew, articles like this from the Washington Post. This is from September 2022. Wounded Ukrainian soldiers reveal steep toll of Kherson offensive. This whole article is about Ukrainians admitting just how badly they were being outfought around Kherson. come 2023, when Ukraine launched their main offensive against Russian forces, it was on a scale too large, and it failed so decisively. It was so decisively defeated by Russian forces, it was no longer possible to continue using this trick, using so-called open source intelligence to convince people that somehow this is a war of attrition, but Ukraine is ultimately winning it. People could see with their own eyes that Ukraine is being outfought, and they can see on the battlefield the absolute lack of equipment and ammunition. So if anything Oryx had been saying up until then had been true, the offensive would have went completely differently. Instead, it was decisively defeated by Russian forces, and Russian forces are continuing to outfight Ukraine all along the line of contact. Despite all of this being demonstrably untrue, IISS is still going to repeat these narratives anyway. The worst part about it is they actually make you pay to access their military balance report, which I did not pay for, and I did not read. And I mean, they're explaining to you that what you're going to read is just war propaganda based on now clearly discredited open source intelligence. And isn't that the story of the West in general? They spend huge amounts of money and time and energy trying to shape narratives with lies instead of investing in the actual means to shape narratives through action. And maybe at this point, many people in the West are starting to understand that just lying about everything isn't going to actually change reality. But when all you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. So that's where we are now. This is where the Western media is right now in regards to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I am later on in the week going to do an entire video on a recent National Defense Industry Strategy report put out by the US Department of Defense. And they go into incredible detail about all of the problems America's military-industrial complex face, and they fail categorically to propose any sort of actual solution to the problem. I will go over that in detail. I will also continue keeping a very close eye on the conflict in Ukraine and conflicts elsewhere as US-led unipolarism struggles against the emergence of multipolarism. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Highly suggest people follow me on Telegram. Absolutely everything gets published there, including backups of all of my videos. In the video description below, you will see all of the links to everything I cited in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. That is what makes this work possible, whether it's through a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others online. That is all very much appreciated. Thank you again, and as always, thank you for watching.